People get married every day, and even though it's a really big event for the people who are involved, it generally isn't newsworthy. But one day in April 2011, these were the front covers on all the major UK newspapers. There wasn't a single national daily that deviated from the idea that this was the most important and interesting thing that happened that day. And you can be fairly well guaranteed that when the royal baby's born in the next week or so, we'll see this situation all over again. And if we want to think about some of the issues and debates that are affecting us at the moment, there's a question of austerity. You know, every day there's news coverage, analysis, comment in the media about the economic crisis, about the causes of it, whether we're going further into crisis, coming out of crisis, how the crisis in Europe is going to affect the British economy, and how governments, banks and businesses should respond. And while all the different newspapers and broadcasters and commentators sort of have disagreements about the degree and the detail on this issue, there's one question that they all concur or they all agree about, and that is the fact that there's no alternative to austerity. And actually what the media say about austerity and how they say it is it's quite important in as much as it has a resonance, in this case in terms of the way people understand the nature and the extent of the crisis, the kinds of responses that they think are available to the government, and also the parameters and potential for change and people's own role in that. And so I think that starts to give you an indication that in general the mass media does play a significant role in shaping how we understand the world. It occupies a very central space in political life in a bourgeois democracy. Governments have whole departments and spend huge resources on trying to intervene in the media with public relations and creating spin around their policies and the particular issues that they have to grapple with. And of course we've seen, when there's a war, it often feels very much like the media is just an extension of the Defence Department or the government's sort of war propaganda machine. And also, the media plays a big role in terms of helping big business and other powerful groups in society to get their message across to a big audience. And for most of us, it's the way that we find out what's happening outside our immediate everyday experience. So there's, we can see there's a reason why dictators are keen to control television and broadcasters or broadcasting or the kinds of information that are accessible on the internet to their citizens when they come into power. And it's because the main stories and views that are covered in the media affect what's discussed, what's deemed important, and the way issues are framed. And it reflects this reflects the existing power structures in society and generally the views of the rich and powerful. So if we think about the sort of role that the media plays in terms of agenda setting and determining the parameters of public debate. In this country, think about the tabloid press and the kind of climate that it's created around questions like immigrants. Immigrants are seen as a drain on society. They're seen as a threat to social cohesion and generally as undesirable and illegitimate. So, I've got a slide for this. This was a story that appeared in the Daily Mail in March this year, where there was a question about a shortfall in school places, and straight away the Daily Mail publishes an article to say that migrants are responsible for this. And that actually not just migrants are responsible for this, but when Romania and Bulgaria are able to come into the UK, this is going to exacerbate this problem. And that kind of response by the tabloid press then set the terms of reference for the debate in the rest of the media, but also in Parliament and in workplaces and canteens and dinner tables up and down the country. And I think, the flip side of that, the flip side of the way that the media sort of just dictates what's important for us to talk about, you can see with the kind of omissions of stories that are in the paper. So to go, and in the news, so to go back to sort of the question of refugees and migrants, I mean, when do you ever actually hear the news reporting about the kinds of contributions that migrants make to this country and the fact that actually migrants contribute more to the tax base than they actually than what's actually spent on them in terms of welfare or services, or about the role actually that British foreign policies play in the creation of refugees and migrants. Similarly, we rarely hear about what Israel's doing in Gaza, and we rarely hear about most strikes and industrial action that takes place. And I think particularly in relation to that last point, how many of us have, we care about we care about what issues come up in the media. Because how often have we been on a demonstration or been on strike and raced home that evening to watch the news or gone onto the internet to find out whether our strike or demonstration has been covered favourably or actually whether it's been covered at all. So I'm just going to respond to somebody down here. This meeting's been changed. So the media reflects the existing power structures in society. But then how do you explain the kind of diversity in the media? I mean, is all media biased? Because obviously you've got the Daily Mail and the Sun, and they're rabidly right-wing and anti-union and racist a lot of the time. But what about other media like the BBC or the Guardian or the Independent that carry stories that challenge the status quo or challenge particular government policies? Or, sometimes publish articles by people like John Pilger and Mark Steele that present a challenge to the system more generally. Because obviously the media is not homogenous. We know, the Telegraph supports the Tory party, the Daily Mirror tends to support the Labor Party, and while it's not quite obvious which the Guardian sort of publishes stories that don't take a particularly necessarily party political position, they're generally posited to the liberal left of centre. So to try and understand why you get this diversity of opinion or how to explain this diversity of opinion that's seen in the mainstream media, I think we understand it largely as reflecting those differences and arguments and disagreements that happen within the ruling class. So even though the ruling class have a common interest in exploiting working people, actually they have different emphases and interests at different points in time about how to run capitalism. At the moment, for example, we know that there are differences in the ruling class around questions about how far or how fast and in what direction to push austerity, or, if you look at Egypt at the moment, how can Britain manoeuvre and try and influence the situation there in order that, we can continue to have trade and investment interests, or how to best continue British trade and investment interests in Egypt without provoking further undesirable radicalisation. And I think also while the media generally address these issues which are of interest to the members of or the capitalist class, they tend to relate them in a way that makes it seem like they're relevant to society as a whole. So, for example, when you see discussions in the media about austerity, it's not framed in terms of a transfer of, how do we best transfer wealth from ordinary working people back to the bankers and into big business, but it's couched in terms of, how do we get the British economy as a whole to grow, because, this is going to be better for us all. We all need to tighten our belts and we're all in this together. I think, so in making these sorts of arguments, while different media tends to reflect differences in detail, they all share a similar set of assumptions, and that is that, one, that capitalism is the only way to organise society, and that some form of bourgeois democracy is the ideal political form. Or another way of thinking about it is all mainstream media is pro-capitalist. So it's taken for granted that economic growth is a good thing for everybody and strikes are a nuisance. So you can start to see how the mass media becomes one very significant way or vehicle through which the capitalist system is legitimised and maintained. I've got a slide here. So, just in terms of thinking about trying to theorise this, Marx and Engels in the German ideology started to develop a theory about how ideas in society develop and gain in popularity. And they argue that ideas arise from material conditions, which went against the prevailing ideas at the time that it was actually ideas that drove history. And what they saw is that the ideas that dominate in any given society tend to be the ideas of the ruling class. And I put that up there just in case people want to sort of read more on that. So if we want to think more about why media has a pro-capitalist bias, we can start to think about it firstly in terms of the fact that, well, these days most media is actually big business, and most media is overwhelmingly owned by and controlled by big corporations and by people who are themselves members of the ruling elite. So in that sense, it's not really very surprising, is it, that the views of the media reflect the views and the values of the people who own and run them. But how powerful are media organisations as organisations? I thought this was quite, I don't know, maybe a bit too small for people to see, but it's quite useful. It goes through some of the biggest media conglomerations in the world and just shows you some of the holdings and the interests that they've got. So you've got AOL Time Warner up there, which has interests in music and movies, but also in publishing and obviously the internet. And then there's Disney over in the corner there, which is involved in not just television but broadcasting and magazines. And then the sort of third biggest one is Bertelsmann, it's a German company, that's the world's biggest publisher. They also own Channel 5 in this country. And if we focus on this country, well, there are two media corporations that are in the FTSE 100. That's B Sky B and ITV. So, and so Rupert Murdoch, who obviously owns hundreds of print publications across the world, owns the Sun, the Times, and the Sunday Times in Britain. But actually, as far as big business goes, like these media holdings are relatively small compared to like your big banking corporations or oil corporations. I think if you compare B Sky B with Royal Dutch Shell, which is the biggest company on FTSE 100, it's actually only worth about a tenth of that company and employs a tiny percentage of people. So obviously there's something about media that gives it a political and an ideological influence that goes beyond its economic weight. And I think that is due to the specific role that media plays in maintaining a capitalist society. And I think people only have to sort of think about Hackgate to see the extent of that influence and the special role that media plays in capitalist society. Thank you. Simon Basketer is actually doing a talk, and we'll talk in a lot more detail about the hacking scandal on Saturday afternoon. But I think during that scandal, which obviously brought questions of the role of media in society very much to the fore, Tony Benn described Rupert Murdoch as probably the most powerful man in the world. I want to keep that one. And while that's an exaggeration, I think the scandal and the revelations that sort of followed it about the ties between Murdoch and the Chipping Norton set, between senior police, politicians and civil servants, really did uncover the sort of staggering degree of intermeshing between the media and the ruling class. And, you know, a big part of that is because for politicians and business leaders, they rely quite heavily on the mainstream media in order to popularise their policies and to a mass audience. And Murdoch's been quite vocal in emphasising this particular role that the papers play in the election of governments. This was the front cover of The Sun in '92 when the Tories, led by John Major, scraped through the general election. And obviously Murdoch wants to remind everybody the part that the Sun and his newspapers played in that. And obviously he has an interest in doing that because he's consistently sought to use this position to try and influence government policy, not just on legislation around media ownership or content and regulation, but actually on much broader issues like foreign policy, for example, and even around the environment. I think during the Blair government, Murdoch was referred to as the 24th member of the cabinet. But I think this, I've got a little thing from Blair on leave services. I'm not going to talk about it that much, but this is Blair addressing police and I think this idea about the influence that the press has over people in terms of their voting preferences and their views is an important one for us to sort of explore as socialists. Because is the media really all powerful in terms of shaping the ideas and the opinions of all people? Because if we believe Murdoch, I mean, basically the media moguls set the agenda, they sort of make decisions on key debates and we all just sort of blindly follow. But I think this idea about how people receive ideas and information is actually quite removed from the reality of how people engage with the kinds of ideas that they come across. For a start, like if you look at the actual influence that the media, that the Murdoch media in particular has over the voting record of its own readership, a much more complex picture starts to emerge. So in the 2010 general election, you've got a situation where both the Times and the Sun carry quite a clear pro-Tory line, yet 22% of Times readers voted for Labor and 24% voted for the Lib Dems. And then if you look at Sun readership, which is much more working class readership, well actually 28% of them, despite being told to vote Tory, ended up voting for Labor. And if you look at altogether that those people who voted but didn't vote for Tories, about 57%. So 57% of Sun readers didn't vote the way that the Sun was urging them to. And I think in trying to theorise this, I think the work of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci is quite useful. Gramsci did quite a lot of work on trying to understand how ideas change in society. And he saw, I mean, for a start, he saw that the ruling class managed to maintain its power on one hand through the coercion or the threat of coercion on the part of the state at various times, but that it also worked through creating consent. And to create that consent, the ruling class relied quite heavily upon institutions of civil society like the media to prop up and to popularise their ideas. It's what Gramsci refers to as, or as an Australian, what I would say hegemony, but uninformed English people would call hegemony. So the media helps to create this common sense view of the world that aligns working people to the people who rule over them. And for, just to give it a sort of an example from recent history, suggesting that British workers have a national interest in keeping migrants out of their workplace, rather than, and out of their country, rather than seeing that as workers we've got an international and an interest that's common to us, and an international one, which is actually to stop bosses from exploiting all of us. But our ideas are obviously not just a reflection of the general opinions put forward by the likes of Murdoch and their media. Ruling ideas have an influence and play a key role in exerting that influence on workers, but workers can still accept those ideas while being perfectly capable of fighting for their own interests. So there will have been in the pensions, the strikes and the demonstrations over pensions, for example, people who voted Tory or Lib Dem. And the other side of that is that actually workers don't just accept socialism, they don't just accept the ideas that promote their interests or necessarily see the possibility of overcoming capitalism. Ideas like nationalism or racism, sexism, homophobia can be accepted to a greater or lesser degree among working people. But I think what's important for socialism and revolutionaries is to recognise that people's ideas change and that people's ideas develop in a context where there's a constant battle for ideas that's taking place in society. People's ideas are shaped by the media, but actually they're also shaped by their personal experience, by their backgrounds and things that happen in their lives. And because of that, people are constantly making judgments about the kind of things that they watch or read in the media. And I think that the influence that the media has is the greatest when people don't have a lot of alternative sources to challenge what they see in the media, and when they're the most marginalised from the processes that are going on in politics and in society more generally, but that people become much, much more critical and challenging of common sense ideas when they start to get drawn into mass struggles, when their struggle becomes the story and they have a direct influence of acting in it and discussing it. So now, this is the thing, and I think I've got this little clip from YouTube. I'm not going to sort of play it for people to watch, but I just have it in the background. I think this clip is a fantastic example of that. People might have seen this. This is a poll that's taken live on Band News, which is a Brazilian news channel. It's actually the most watched Brazilian news channel in Brazil. And it was being taken during the demonstrations that started over fare hikes in public transport. People might have seen there were mass demonstrations. People climbed on top of the Parliament building in Brasilia. Maybe no sound. Play it. So they set up, this is basically just a live poll, and they've set it up, and you can sort of see, I don't know if you can see the thing, but the poll, has the poll started yet? The poll starts. The presenter is giving quite a hard line. It's quite clear that people are not supposed to vote in favour. The question being asked is, are you in favour of these demonstrations? And the presenter sort of gets, you can sort of see, it starts to build up. The presenter gets, as people are voting the wrong way, people are voting in favour of the demonstrations, the presenter's getting increasingly agitated. These are violent demonstrations, surely we can't accept the violence, and it goes on. And they even start the poll again and get the same result. And I think, so you can see that in this situation where people are drawn into mass struggles, which you can see in the background, this is having very little effect on how people see the world. Let it play through, because it's pretty funny. Maybe not all.
Mas quase 1.700 pessoas que na mais estão dizendo sim. A voz do povo é a voz de Deus. Está pau a pau, mas tem muito mais gente dizendo que sim do que não. Isso tem que estar paiado. Será que nós formulamos mal a pergunta? Você é a favor do protesto com panela? Eu acho que essa seria a pergunta. 2.839 pessoas disseram que são a favor desse tipo de protesto. O cara que liga, está vendo ali tudo calmo, tranquilo, pode achar até que a pergunta. Faça a pergunta da forma que eu pedi para formular. Eu sou contra o aumento do ingresso, a favor de melhoria do transporte coletivo, não teria aumentado as taxas. Eu não teria aumentado mesmo. Mas eu faça a pergunta do jeito que eu pedi, por favor. Você é a favor do protesto com baderna? O cara não entende. Cadê a outra pesquisa que eu pedi para fazer? Para ver se as pessoas entenderam ou não, se é isso mesmo. Você é a favor de protesto com baderna? Então está começando só a pesquisa. Para ver se o povo não tinha entendido outra vez, eu tinha. Mas o povo já se é de ônibus, se é de trem, se é de metrô, o povo está tão pela vida que apoia qualquer tipo de protesto. Fiz 2 pesquisas, achei até que uma palavra poderia simplesmente não estar sendo bem entendida, a palavra protesto, poderia inovar com um protesto com baderna ou sem baderna, mas as 2 pesquisas deram praticamente a mesma proporção do mesmo resultado. As pessoas estão apoiando o protesto porque não querem aumento de passagem. Então pode tirar daqui.
So yeah, I think that demonstrates my point quite amply. But I think the question does arise: how do we engage with the media? And I think there are different views on the left about this. Because some people argue that we should conduct our campaigns or our industrial actions with one eye on the media and about how our struggles might be presented to the outside world via mainstream media. Most people will have been in campaigns where arguments come up like, Well, we need to be media savvy, we need to get our branding right. We shouldn't use words like socialism or workers because it alienates people. I was actually involved in the anti-capitalist movement in the late 90s, and I remember being at organising meetings there where we were told, well, we should wear suits so we look very respectable, you know, things like this come up. But I think the idea that we can change society, or even that we can change the media by approaching our political activity or our industrial struggles in this way is total fantasy. And I think ultimately it runs the risk that in pursuing the media, we end up completely making serious compromises and concessions in terms of our ability to fight back. So, but on the other hand, you know, despite this analysis that actually the media is capitalist and that consistently operates in the interest of capitalism, I don't think it would either be wise to ignore it. I think we need a strategy for dealing with the media that recognises or understands its limitations. So, of course we want to try and get our stories in the media. If we have a successful campaign that stops the closure of a fire station, for example, or we manage to stop someone getting evicted from their homes, we want to send press releases out. We want to try and get that covered, particularly in our local papers. And we want people who are confident to give interviews to the media when they get a chance. And I think we have to recognise that as individuals and even as small groups in society, the influence that we have on the media is negligible. Even when we give interviews, we have very little control over how they're presented. I was involved on the eve of Thatcher's death. I was involved. We had a little party down in Brixton. You might have heard about it. And I talked to a journalist. I had an Evening Standard journalist come and ask me about it. And I talked about Thatcher and the legacy of Thatcherism and her sell-off of council housing, and I started to talk about all the different campaigns that we were involved in now to try and preserve council housing and stop people being evicted around the bedroom tax. When I opened the Evening Standard, the next one, I didn't open it, it was on the front cover, what did they say? I'd said, yeah, lots of people wanted to have a party. So, I mean, another argument that comes up now more and more is almost like the opposite view, which is with the internet, the availability of alternative news sources and information online, and the possibility that gives to allow activists and people to sort of share knowledge and information without it being mediated by big corporations. We can ignore mainstream media, or we can start to ignore mainstream media and focus on building our own information networks. Or the idea that, you know, lots of people already, particularly young people, don't read the newspapers. They've already turned away from mainstream newspaper and broadcasters for their news in favour of alternative and more direct sources. And I think the question of social media is an incredibly important one for revolutionaries. And Simon Assaf is going to be talking in detail about that on Saturday morning, so I recommend if you're interested in that you go along to his session. But just to say a few words about social media and the internet and how they affect what effect they have on the power of the media. I mean, it's certainly the case that WikiLeaks and even clips on YouTube or information that comes direct through Twitter has publicised information and events that the governments and big business would have preferred us not to know about, and created big difficulties for them. And I think obviously, I think of course that's to be welcomed. I think like any new technology that enables us to communicate or to organise, we need to seek to engage with them and maximise their potential towards our own ends, making them sort of tools of agitation and organisation. But the extent to which the internet has replaced the mainstream media as an alternative source of information, I think has often been greatly overstated. You know, for the vast majority of people who don't have time to sort of trawl the internet, mainstream media is still the main way we find out about what's going on in the world. And actually, even people who don't read newspapers, who sort of get their news through Facebook or Google Plus or Tumblr or whatever it is, actually largely what they're reading and sharing and the opinions that they're getting originate from the mainstream media. And if we want to have a conversation with people in our colleges or our workplaces or what have you, well, actually, the issues that we're going to find ourselves talking about are generally going to reflect the kinds of discussions that are going on in mainstream media. So I think social media and the internet are still largely capitalist media. I think as long as we live in a society where there's a small class of people who own the means to develop the technology and who own the resources to collect and produce and disseminate news, the media, online and off, is overwhelmingly going to reflect their ideas and interests. I think our main aim needs to be to create the conditions where not just the content of the media, but the whole relationship and structure to power is changed. Just going back quickly to the question of media corporations being capitalist enterprises, it's also the case that, you know, in order to produce, the production of media involves vast numbers of workers, often actually poorly paid workers, print workers, camera operators, sound recorders. And those people hold the potential to come in conflict with their bosses and management over questions like wages and conditions, but actually also over questions of editorial content. In 2006, members of the National Union of Journalists, which I'm a member of, at the Daily Star, they managed to stop the publication of an edition of their newspaper that was going to press, and it was run as a daily fatwa edition. It was a send-up edition to show readers of the Star what the paper would look like under Sharia law. So they set up to have a page 3 burqa babe. The editorial was blank because it had been censored. And I think staff took the decision that they were going to walk out unless that content was pulled, because they could see quite clearly that it was racist and that it would incite racial hatred. And they were successful in doing that. I think, you know, if you look at Greece, I mean, one of the things I've found really exciting as a media worker has sort of been, and as I followed the sort of things that have happened in Greece over the past few years, the struggle of journalists who sort of, you know, as part of this movement that's grappling with political power and trying to take control of their lives, journalists have occupied television stations and taken control of the content of news channels in Greece. Just 2 weeks ago, the Greek government announced that they were going to shut down ERT, which is basically their public broadcasting equivalent to the BBC. And there were 2,700 jobs under threat. And in response, the media workers have occupied the station in order to protect their jobs and continued to broadcast. And that prompted a general strike in their support. So I think the working class and media workers can play a role in the media, but in times of social upheaval, actually, the control of newspapers and broadcasting actually becomes a central place of struggle. During the Portuguese Revolution in 1974, the editorial room became a really hot spot of class conflicts, with workers supporting the revolution and management fighting against them on that. And workers took over one radio station in particular, and its programming was determined by General Assembly, and it was used to disseminate information about struggle and strategy. So I think, of course, in order to get into a position where workers can challenge the state and to start to take over television stations and break the influence and the rule of the capitalist caste, we have to argue our side in the battle of ideas. And that's why a big part of what Socialist Worker Party do, for example, is to produce and sell a paper that fights for ideological clarity among working people. Was that like 0 time? Okay, yeah, cool, perfect. So, you know, what are we trying to do in producing our own newspaper is to give people the arguments and the confidence that will help them to struggle, breaking some of these myths and the lies that you find in the mainstream media, myths and lies that attempt to divide us and to counter that propaganda, but also to debate the strategies that are going on in the struggle. And it's a way that we communicate our victories to other people, so that when we do save our fire station, we can tell people about it, so they then know how to go and save their fire station, for example. And of course, in selling it to other people face to face, we're coming in contact with other people who are engaged in the struggle, which is people who want to build a revolutionary organisation, quite an important thing to do. But to just sum up and return to the question of power of the media, I think the media is influential, especially when people are passive and marginal to the political process. And it depends, and it'll always depend on the particular issue that's being discussed or reported or presented, and how that relates to people's experience. And that influence, and the influence of the media is definitely at its weakest when there's mass resistance. But I think our task as people who want to change the world and as revolutionaries is first and foremost to build a resistance that can challenge the capitalist media and ultimately the system that supports it. But of course part of that is arming working people and activists and other people who want to take struggle about what are the stories and ideas that can help them lead and challenge ruling ideas and give them the confidence to fight.
So Francis Roy from the Irish SWP. Just want to, it's more like on tactics, like back home in Ireland, we do the old traditional stalls and they are very good, but we also on YouTube, one of our organisers, he does regular episodes. It's something, I don't know if it's happening over here. I wonder if anybody from the British SWP can come in and say, are they doing like episode 1, episode 2, like as the speaker was saying, we should be highlighting every victory we get. Like for example, in Ireland, we had a victory with the oil out in the southeast of Dublin with the oil with a corporate with Tony O'Reilly and Department of Communication, and we also had a big victory with the forestry. Now we had a big loss with the property tax because the revenue was brought in and the media basically took over. And in that point, is the media all powerful? Yes and no. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. As the Brazilian example showed, that people are not listening and not quite going on the same line anymore. But there are ways we can, besides the traditional. Now, the traditional, it's something like talking to, your like the person on the street when you come up with your stall. That is still very important. But tactically, we should use social media more, like YouTube, in interviewing members who are involved in campaigns, particularly when the SWP here has a victory in Jobsbridge or pissing off David Cameron. Like there's lots of ways we can get our message around. Anyway, on that.
Partly asking for a clarification, something you said at the beginning, because it seemed like at the very beginning that you were arguing that at least the print media is just restricted different strands of ruling class opinion, which is, certainly if you look at someone like Polly Toynbee, who has suddenly become a great anti-capitalist, you can see in which she is only viewing a different idea from within the ruling class. But I think if you start talking about people like Mark Steele and John Pilger, it's a bit more complicated, that there's no section of the ruling class that actually agrees with Mark Steele and John Pilger. Similarly, despite whatever Rupert Murdoch thinks, it was Fox, I think it was Fahrenheit, but it wasn't Fahrenheit 9/11, it was Bowling for Columbine, but one of the first big Michael Moore films was brought out by Fox Media, which was arguing something against what's in Rupert Murdoch's head. But one of the wonderful contradictions of capitalism is they'll sell anything if they can get money from it, which means that there is a space which is open for us to put forward our opinions, because at the very end they're more interested in making money than in keeping power as a class. I think I'd say there's three reasons why we could talk about the flexibility of media and the way in which we're able to operate out also inside the official media. One you've talked about already, which is that print workers, journalists are workers. That it's not the fact that Rupert Murdoch sits at home and dictates every issue of the Sun, every issue of the Times and so on. So within limited parameters, people are able to fight not just for better working conditions for themselves, but better conditions in which they operate and what they're allowed to print. And there have been various victories which have meant that open up the media, and which has partly led to which that people like Mark Steele get a platform. The other thing is that when you say the dominant ideas, that the idea of the ruling class, dominant is not the same as all pervasive. That at any one time the ruling class put forward an idea which is accepted by most of the people, but which goes against the experience of a number of people at the same time. And so, if we had a media in which there was no Mark Steele, no John Pilger, no Richard Seymour, let's say, that a lot of people would say they're lying to us. They are not reflecting our opinions at all. And so, connected to the level of struggle, in as much as we go against them, then it's opened up and they feel obliged to print something which means that people feel they're not being completely fooled. Last of 1992, I remember doing the big campaign against pig closures. For about 2-3 weeks, the Daily Mirror turned into an agitational newspaper in terms of building demonstrations of 300,000 people. It didn't do it because of a sudden change of heart in the minds of the people who run the Daily Mirror. It was that they had their best ever print run in years because they connected with what people were thinking. And the fact that there is always a consistent opposition to the ruling class ideas means that the space for us, not just within YouTube, but also to work to a limited extent within the official media.
Yes, a couple of things really. I suppose the first thing is, I think it's right that the media's always been a battleground, right, stuff around it. It's not just the case that it's a block, right, stuff about, because we can talk about, you know, people like Owen Jones and Mark Steele and people today. Obviously there's people like Paul Foot and other people who use it inside of it. Obviously this is just the British media as well you're talking about. So because they are, some of the newspapers reflect more a social democratic point of view, or exactly what Conman was just saying about trying to draw people in from different milieus and stuff about it. There is a way to fight through the mainstream media. It's actually why they spend so much time trying to kind of marginalise the room for journalists to operate in that way at the moment, really. I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing really is about the media and struggle, because there's a hashtag at the minute or stuff that's just put out called Teacher Raw, right? And this came after the strike that happened a couple of weeks ago in the northwest of England. I don't even, if you're read socialist worker, you probably will know that something like, I don't know, 50, 60,000 teachers, right, stuff around, or maybe more actually, right, stuff were on strike for the day in the northwest of England, right. So it was an extraordinarily powerful strike. 5,000 people marching through a demonstration in Manchester, right, stuff, 3,000 people marching in Liverpool, and then the teachers get home and the strike hasn't happened. They turn on TV, what a wonderful day, all the schools were shut, advice something bad. And there's absolutely no mention of this event at all. It didn't happen and stuff about it, which I suppose in one way leads people to try to go through the argument about how we need to use other forms of media and the rest of it, which are crucial, by the way. People looked at the strike that went on the bins recently and stuff, unofficial action in Brighton and stuff, and people with brilliant use of Twitter, of their own materials being pulled out and the rest of it. The other point, though, is you can win without getting covered. Right, stuff about it, right? And I'll give you an example of that. There were around the recent there was a dispute which we pushed very hard on, and we were involved in and stuff around electricians around the country over the attack on their conditions. And in central London, for week after week, there were protests of hundreds and hundreds of workers who occupied building sites, who had pitched battles with the police in the middle of the road, right? Stuff about a thing like that. This was going on for months. And the only time they ever got on TV was at one stage. We went on an unofficial march from a building site. We went through the square where Occupy was happening, outside St Paul's, and we surrounded a news event that was going on anyway, right? So this was the one time in this whole period that culminated in unofficial strikes, a big victory against employers, right? Stuff and the rest of it, but huge multinational companies. It was on TV once. And the real point of it is really stuff, even in a condition where we should use any form of media we can. We have to use the mainstream media, we have to try to use our own media, the left, we need to use social medias and things, how these work and the rest of it. These are all tools within it, but the real point is we are still powerful in the situation. That's when you talk about does the media control things. The media did control the coverage of that strike. The workers did beat Balfour Beatty, which is one of the biggest companies in the world.
Right, yeah, I've read a lot of journals into media and that, and the ones that are saying that the media control ourselves and the radical left, the revolutionary left, they tend to think it's some kind of conspiracy, that the media are there just to conspire against us, whatever. But I don't think it's not a conspiracy. What it is the media is a means of production. And what they produce is newspapers or a news show or whatever. Yeah, or just some sort of entertainment, Simpsons or something. Like, pretty much. Therefore, because it's a means of production, we live under capitalism. Capitalism, the means of production owned by the capitalists, it is controlled by the capitalists. And those capitalists say what is made, like any other workplace. Doesn't matter what you're making, the capitalists control what you make. And it's the same here. But from the point, so when they're making media, they do it from the point of view of the capitalists. So whatever they say there. But the thing is, for workers to get to take on or accept what they're saying, it has to somewhat relate to reality. You can't just say that there's literally a white elephant in the room, or literally there's flying saucers crashing down the earth right now. You can't just say something that's so sort of bizarre. You know, you'd have to say something that relates somehow to your reality. Now, like, I thought for ages, why the fuck do people like police, yeah? I was thinking, you know, they're bastards. They always come in, they always fuck us over and all the rest of it. But, actually, I remember my mate said, like, I've been in a lot of quiet situations where you thought maybe we should ring the police. And there was one point where we thought someone got murdered, and pretty much they said, what the fuck would you do? You have to ring the police. Because who else can you ring? And even though they're bastards, you know that they're on the other side of the frame. And the media puts that. Who else can you do it? The community couldn't possibly deal with it. You couldn't deal with it. The police does. But there's points in history, yeah, where people's reality changes in such a way that an old arguments that always need police can change. For example, yeah, like Hillsborough, yeah, pretty much there, the police said that it was the fans that caused the 89 people dead, I think. Pretty much, but obviously people in Liverpool and people, the fans and that, saw it, that wasn't the case. They saw that actually the police pinned in too many people there, and the police were the ones that caused the problem, rather than the fans pissing and whatever. But the Sun put out saying that that was the case, that fans were being at too much. And there was a big boycott of that in Liverpool and then around the area, where people actually said, look, actually the media is lying about this. So, even though the media can frame things, but they can't adapt to a situation. Ideas don't control what happens in the material world. The material controls what happens in the material world, and the ideas adapt to that. And then therefore we adapt to, you know, it's a dialectic process. But anyway, that's it.
Yeah, the first point is everyone in this room and everyone that gets involved with the campaign, I'm absolutely convinced one of your first ports of call is use the media. Well, it doesn't matter what it is, you do a press release, you take photographs and you put it on the media. And because everything that the speaker said and everyone else has said, the media is a machine of the ruling class. But it's not all powerful, it's like a fruit machine that never pays off. Every so often it has to pay out, and that's the role of the likes of Mark Steele and Pilger and the rest of it. So your first port of call is try and use it. Your second port of call is we absolutely, as top priority, need an alternative. Every campaign needs a Facebook page, needs a website, etc. We as a revolutionary socialists have to have an organisation just so that we're all pulling in the same direction. The third thing is, the next strand is, we can't just say, oh, we'll build an alternative. I think we have to have a critique of the media, and we have to. It is a form of battle, not just for the people involved, but for us as well. The BBC is meant to be impartial, and the BBC came out with this amazing. It was reporting on the Nakba of '48, when 700,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, and the BBC said, well, the demonstrators in Palestine were demonstrating against the Nakba when thousands of Palestinians left their home. So thousands, i.e. 2 orders of magnitude out, and left their home is slightly different from being ethnically cleansed. So you go through all the appeals procedure. If anyone's done this with the BBC, somebody has to do it, and someone with more time than most people have has to do it. But at the same time as that, we have to point out the absolute bias. And so when there was a lot of activity over one of the atrocities of Israel, we could get 50 people outside of the BBC saying you're hopelessly biased and you're not telling the truth. I want to finish up with a very, very brief question. My recollection of Portugal and Renaissance, wasn't it, the radio station, was because they couldn't easily reclaim it. My recollection is they blew it up, so it shows the media is important.
Hello. So I missed the initial part of your speech, not that they get it, but one of the things I wondered if you
Can't hear you.
Sorry, is that better? Yeah. Okay, so one of the things I was going to say was about how the media, when we talk about media, it's seen all its forms. It's not just the news, film, television, music, and all them other elements. And I wondered what your thoughts were on basically the big conglomerate. You know, you said that they're not as financially powerful, say, as an oil company. But when you consider like that slide you had up at Disney as a total, as a whole, their power is, you know, the influence that they have is more important perhaps than financial strength that they have compared to an oil company. So the problem with the news is they're not telling you what to think, but they are telling you what to think about. And when you have all them other avenues that they're linked with, the message is powerful and it's repeated time and time again. And that's why we don't have any protest music anymore in the mainstream. Kill the artists, kill the protests, and that's basically what they've managed to do. So yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Hi there, yes, you're listening from Scotland. Hi, just a couple of things. I know I'm a speaker man, right? I'm from Glasgow way, so I don't get on about the media. Now, SWP, there's been all the coverage and all the rest of it, and after that, they were actually never the Anti-Pregnant Tax Federation interview park in Glasgow. And all of a sudden, these ones, because they've started making money, decided, oh, wait a minute, we've got a story here, we've got the thing to do it. But the thing is, SWP was already in first. But see, we really want something. You really got to fight for it, and that's what we do in Scotland. We went on a demonstration, and we done it, no police, no nothing, and that's how they came. And the media started making, they sell thousands of these up in Scotland. And I tell you now, I'd have to go to WSP and get the papers on. Right?
I want to say something about the contradictions of the media, because I think it's important to say that the media is actually quite open to ideas from outside, because it does have to reflect the reality of society to some extent. When Thatcher died, for example, on the day of her funeral, there's no doubt the media were anxious to hear people who would be against Thatcher. Not that that was the dominant coverage, but there was space for it. I did 17 interviews on the day that Thatcher died for the world's press, which gathered around central London. Now, did that change everything? No, at all. I'm not claiming that for a moment. But it is quite important to understand the opportunities that sometimes are open to people because of the real world. And I think the media is full of contradictions. To take one example, think about Mo Farah during the Olympics. This was quite a difficult issue for papers like the Mail and the Express on one level. Here is Mo Farah, as an immigrant, worse than that, an asylum seeker in fact, a Somali and a Muslim, but a great British hero because he won 2 Olympic gold medals. Now, the media was not so stupid as to say Mo Farah is a scrounger and a feckless bastard. He wasn't. He was a great British hero. The thing they managed to do, though, was say that Mo Farah is a good sort of immigrant, whereas most of them aren't like Mo Farah. And that's quite a difficult thing for the media to do. And it does, you know, they're quite happy to be shameless about it. So Mo Farah is fantastic. The next day, the Mail and Express would have a vicious front page about how immigrants are to blame for the problems in Britain. And I can remember in the 1990s, the Mail and Express both absolutely shamelessly took up the case of Zimbabwean asylum seekers because they were against Mugabe, and then returned to just being nasty about asylum seekers again. So they're capable of doing this because they don't have to do it in every specific example. They have to create a general view about the impossibility of transformation around the society we live in, and the general sense of being against immigrants, asylum seekers, foreigners, and so on. But we should seek to use the opportunities that are created by it. Secondly, he said, quite important to underline that the Sun was not what won it for the Tories under John Major in 1992. You have to remember that just before that, Thatcher had been driven out by the poll tax revolt. 14 million people had refused to pay the poll tax, with not a single newspaper encouraging them not to pay the poll tax. It wasn't the Sun that won it, it was Neil Kinnock that lost it. That's the truth about what happened in 1992. My final point is this, that there will be opportunities when people's real experience comes into conflict with what the media are telling them. I mean, the media is not generally as stupid as the media in Turkey. I don't know if you know, during the protests against Erdogan, which didn't cover, the main state television channel didn't cover them at all. Not at all. It just showed films of penguins and so on during the protest. Now that's quite unusual, though. That's very stupid, because if people have a sense that there's this mass movement on the streets and all they see is penguins, they are going to think that the things are fixed, and that's not very good the next time they try and sell something to you. So we have to use the opportunities and understand that the contradictions in life are big enough at various points to force the opportunity, and that's when socialists have provided an alternative, organisation, a different form of media and so on.
I think that's very clear. That isn't the fact that he made the newspaper corporations actually an introduction of newspapers, which is portraying the influence, because it's clearly not the case that the Sun and the Daily Mail and the Guardian outsell the Socialist Worker and the Morning Star and the Western left press. It's clearly not, because we've got to have three shots of a printing press. We can certainly produce enough copies to outsell that, because if we sell them, we've got the money to do that. It is clearly much more complex issue, the ideas being presented, and the fact that these major media is actually the hardest problem is because it's consistent with the position they've already presented and they've already established within society. And that's why it's we are trying to change the position, which is why it's more difficult for us. But
yeah, look, thanks for that. There were some really interesting points, I think, that came out of the discussion. I think the question about the contradiction of selling mass media is an interesting one. I mean, a few people brought up the fact that, well, you know, I think Phil was talking about we get our Mark Steeles and our John Pilgers, and Fox will even release a Michael Moore. I mean, this is one of the real problems for the mass media, isn't it? That, like, actually the way that it operates, it relies on a mass audience, which by and large means a working class audience. It needs, you know, the way that the political economy of the media, if you like, is set up, is that media corporations need to have an audience. They need to be able to convince people that their newspaper or their television is worth reading, and so at points they will make concessions, and that hasn't actually always been the case. I think, you know, originally, if you look at newspapers in particular, they were quite elite kind of particular interests of different business people. So the mass media creates this contradiction for media bosses, in the sense that they do, on some level, have to relate to where people are at. And I think the example that somebody, I think it was Marcus, used about Hillsborough is a great one, that actually when this disaster happened, and the Sun sought to deflect the blame away from the police, that actually it's still almost impossible for the Sun to sell copies in Liverpool because, and I think that also, that goes back to the idea that people who have experience of the news and can see that actually what's being reported to them isn't the truth or isn't the facts, are going to make a judgment about that, and they're going to make a judgment that actually this newspaper isn't telling us the truth, it isn't delivering us something that we want to see or hear. I mean, I think that the Thatcher example is interesting because nationally, I could have started out rather than the royal wedding with the Thatcher thing. All the national papers in this country were in some way sort of creating this iconography around Thatcher. And certainly when the protests first started, there was huge public anger in the paper about the fact that you would celebrate death and this is disgusting, this poor old woman, and think of her family. But actually, as the week went on, the things tended to shift, and I think what happened is that the media recognised that there was this feeling among ordinary people whose lives were affected and are still affected by Thatcher, that actually maybe there was a discussion that went beyond just adulation towards this woman. And then in particular, if you looked at the local newspapers in the north and areas that were most affected by the miners' dispute and where Thatcher had an influence, well actually there were regional papers that came out with front covers that were actually, almost as antagonistic as our fantastic Socialist Worker paper was that week. So I think this is one of the contradictions that media bosses face in terms of trying to sell their ideas to a mass audience, but then actually trying to sell their paper or their news program to a mass audience. I was going to say something about journalists as workers, which I think is a difficult question that I maybe don't have time to go into. But in terms, I think generally in terms of the power of the media isn't all powerful, and the way that we as people who want to change the world position ourselves in relation to it is quite important. But I think we need to take as the starting point that fundamentally, if we don't own the media, then we don't really control the content, and we can seek to influence it, and we need to be clear that we do seek to influence it. But that equally, just trying to create an alternative media is not going to be the answer. That ultimately, in order to change the media, we need to take control of the media through broader struggles that we have against the system as a whole.